Day. Welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show on Power Talk 1210 KEVT, Sahuarita, Tucson. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today. The key to my guest's groove is relentless pursuit of authentic musicians. Finding these musicians and placing them in his group because they will grow the sound. The names abound: Phillips, Anger, Marshall, Craven, Carroll, and more. The musicians fill my guest's sails with exuberance and enthusiasm, so much so that it inspires him to combine elements of two different tunes to create an original composition. These elements come from the hot swing club of Django and the miles of music made by a trumpeter named Davis, whom my guest heard on the nightly radio broadcast by Al Jasbo Collins' Purple Grotto. He has brought its sextet to perform tonight at the Mesa Performing Arts Center. It's one of several bands my guest leads, and maybe the hardest to corral. Lots of individual voices, the need to be heard. It's up to my guest to see that the discussion is vibrant and selfless, adhering to the essential arrangements within the tune while still allowing improvisation, being able to play the same tunes differently every time. He has been working harder than ever, adhering to family obligations, his new home in Washington State, and crisscrossing the country with cats like George Marsh, Del McCoury, or his son Samson. Live from Mesa, Arizona, David Grisman, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Hey, thanks, Jake. It's great to be here. Great to meet the man behind the voice.
The man behind the voice. Yeah, last time you said, let's do it in person. So it's such an honor. But I do want to open up. You're playing tonight with the sextet, and you're going to have a rehearsal after this before the show.
Yeah.
Can you talk to the audience about? You guys haven't gigged in a few months. Tell me about the preparation that goes in that you want to do with the band for tonight's show.
Well, actually, we've been working on a recording project, and which we recorded in July and May. We did some sessions in California at a new studio, Studio E. For me, Dawg Studios got dismantled in the process of relocating. But I've been working on editing this record and picking the tunes and the tracks. And so last night we all arrived, and I sent them all a text as listening party. 10:30 in my room, and so I played him, the progress report, 10 new tunes, or as Hal Blaine says, if you haven't heard them, they're new. And so I knew, I wanted to hear what they thought about, the progress of the project. It also knew that listening to these tunes that, that kind of remind him of them, because they're all kind of new for the repertoire. And then, we generally, when we all lived in California, which up till a couple of months ago when I took off, but we actually, I've got two recent members of the band, Chad Manning and George Cole, who joined about almost 2 years ago, and so having an all Bay Area band, which I haven't had for at least a decade, we actually started rehearsing, just going over stuff and refine. I always hear little things. And
last time I talked to you, the guitar player you were talking, he was trying to get on top of the material. How's he fitting in now?
He's doing great.
He's doing good.
Yeah, he's a wonderful guitar player, great guy, and very dedicated. That's what it really takes. No matter how great a musician someone is, if they're playing something a little different than what they're used to, it takes a little. To me, the natural ability of someone and their, musicianship is, that's great as a starting point, really. But then, the work begins for me, and that includes me too. Even Stefan Grappelli, where I wrote the music for him to play King of the Gypsies. I was amazed to see him when I first showed him these tunes. He actually, was struggling. on his level, you know.
Well, what did that look like? Can you? I mean, because you know we're talking about a that's I was just going to get to that.
It was very minor struggling. It wasn't, you know, but nevertheless, this is one of my heroes who, you know, was a master, and I hardly ever heard him play anything that wasn't like supreme. It was eye-opening.
So the tracks that you or the album that you're working on with the sextet, that was done in a live context, or was it was it a city winery maybe or something? Where
no, well, it was live in the studio.
It was live in the studio, and these are tunes that you guys, new tunes that you're going to play.
Well, some tunes that I'd been playing for several years but never recorded. And actually, you mentioned the Purple Grotto. There's one called the Purple Grotto.
Really? Dedicated to Jazzbo?
Dedicated to Jazzbo. And I actually had recorded it on a previous session with a previous band and never used it. But I mean, it's a good tune. It's a little derivative of Benny Goodman, but
right.
You know, we'll see if I get away with it.
You work with this band. Obviously, I transcribe. I'm transcribing a lot of our interviews, and you talked about basically, guys are in the band because you already dig their playing. Okay, you already like what they're doing. You already feel comfortable playing with them. How quickly do these guys pick up? I mean, you're going to play a lot of these tunes tonight. You had a listening party last night, but it's not stuff that's in the repertoire.
Well, it is in the repertoire. I try to start playing stuff right away.
Right away.
Even if it's not fully realized. Because, you know, you can rehearse in a hotel room or in your living room, and that's great. But there's nothing like the pressure of a gig to make things,
I love it.
You know, either come together or, I mean, you know, it's a challenge to me. Plus, you know, at my age, I just turned 70. I don't even buy green bananas anymore.
Why is that?
You think about it.
No, here's the thing. The idea of the pressure, can you talk about how the pressure is fun?
Well, I like challenges. I mean, it's not necessarily fun, but it's. I think it's therapeutic. I think it's good for making things. You know, when we get on a stage and we're, you know, you're very you know, ideally you're very focused on stuff, and even if you screw up, you'll. You know, good musicians realize. And if they don't realize, I'll tell them. But
yeah, right. No,
you know, it just. I know there are a lot of things in these songs. The tunes are not technically that difficult. You know, within the realm of technical music, but they do have little things that you have to remember, and you know. And that's, you know, aside from the soloing. And so to just get that together quicker, I think it's good to just try and go do it, you know, because that's the final result of this is taking it out and playing it for people, you know.
You talk about, we've talked before to going to the 5 Spot, the Apollo Theater. These were places that had a huge impact on your musical psyche. I've never heard anybody put it that way, but I never heard you mention the Palladium, and you have a lot of you love the Latin. I mean, the Tito Puente stuff.
Oh yeah, well I never went to the Palladium.
I guess tell me some of the Latin cats that you really got off on, because a lot of you have a lot of Latin tunes.
You know, I never listened to a lot of Latin music, you know, but I heard it. You know, it was all over the place, if you noticed, you know. And,
like where?
Oh, on the radio, you know, on TV, you know. What's her name? Chiquita Banana.
Uh-huh.
What's her name?
It'll come to me.
She had the vegetables in her.
I only bring it up because, I interviewed Al Di Meola, and he was a Jersey cat.
Yeah.
He would go to these Latin clubs underage. Somehow he got in. And then he would just work on the rhythm. And your rhythm is so strong. Shaughnessy played it.
But,
for
to be honest, my quote-unquote Latin dog music is really not authentic.
That's what I want to talk about.
It's my take on it, and I'll be the first to admit that, the way to, and I'm, a real admirer of authentic styles. But, I also get ideas, and, it was when Richard Green and I started the Great American Music Band, which was kind of the forerunner of my quintet, where the idea was we were kind of out of bluegrass music, and the idea was, could we succeed in just being an instrumental group, rather? And so we realized or thought that the key to that, one big part of that, would be variety. In other words, you couldn't just play fiddle breakdowns for 75 minutes, So, and as soon as that concept started becoming reality, I had been writing tunes, but all of a sudden I started trying to write in different styles, really. So, a samba kind of rhythm, what I would call a dog sound. Instead of the bluegrass bass, we go boom, 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 boom. And jazz bass, we go boom, 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 boom. And samba bass, doom, 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 doom. And so I, wanted to incorporate that kind of groove, and also boom, 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 bossa nova kind of. I had heard, the Stan Getz,
the
bossa
Girl from
nova,
Ipanema,
all of that stuff,
sure.
And Xavier Cugat. It was in all kinds of movies from the 40s, where guys with these Cuban guys, Desi Arnaz, they had.
Were you listening? Because there were cats on the West Coast, Shelly Manne, those guys were playing all the ethnic stuff was coming in at that time.
And in jazz, there were a lot of Latin, jazz cats,
conga players,
picked up on all that Latin stuff. So,
can you talk about a specific tune with the Great American Music Band, if that's where it really was conceived, where you put your own dog taste on Latin music?
Well, looking back on it, I would think Dogology has got some Latin. It's also bebop. It's hard for me to, it's definitely a mongrel breed.
But here's the better question: can you look back on that time? Because that was the first time you were really experimenting with different rhythms. Do you look back? It seems it's impressive. Maybe it's not authentic Latin music, but it was bold. You had to take a chance in order to do it.
Well, I was just having fun.
And you were burned out with bluegrass, kind of.
Well, going back to Duke Ellington, there's good music and there's bad music, and I'm not burnt out on good music. Good bluegrass, good anything.
Right.
I still love it. But I obviously liked lots of different kinds of music, because good music is not just relegated to one kind of music. There's so many great styles of music, from classical to bebop and swing and gypsy music and Indian music. There's so many. It's a big, wide musical world, and I always connected with the mandolin as, it could play anything. I saw the potential in this instrument that, I could play anything on it if I could figure it out, you know.
Well, that's what I mean with Bela Fleck when I interviewed him when he saw Return to Forever at 17, and he saw what Chick Corea was doing. He goes, "Well, all those notes are on the banjo. I just have to find them."
Right.
It's great to have that open mind. That to me, there is a Latin tinge within. So Dawgology, is there any other?
Well, an early tune, I think it was in the quintet, but 1616. When I look back on it, Blue Midnight is it's got some, a little bit of Night in Tunisia in it. Not that that's
right.
Latin, but
No.
I mean it is boom, 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 boom. I mean that kind of triplet bass figure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. They say, good composers borrow, great composers steal. So, I would hear these things and get ideas and, and often they would be combinations of these elements as opposed to, bluegrass was great for me because I got to really study authentic bluegrass with authentic bluegrass musicians, and I learned how that was put together in a way that I never learned how anything else was put together, because you just have to immerse yourself, put yourself under the teaching of a master of that style, and then go through an apprenticeship, and which for a lot of musicians that's the whole ball of wax. That's their life,
I wanted to ask you about Samson.
Just one style, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Your son.
Yes.
Okay, he is in Nashville now.
Well, he's
that's what
he's
Facebook,
on his honeymoon right now.
He's on. Well, congratulations.
No,
I mean, marriage is it's
In
a
fact,
lot
Tracy just subbed for him on 2 gigs.
On bass?
She's quite a good, and she got a first review out of the first gig in Roanoke, Virginia. They said she was a solid bass player.
Just for the audiences, Tracy, David's beautiful wife, is here. Obviously now an amazing, competent bass player as well that I didn't realize. Anyway, Samson, I haven't heard him play, but
really?
he seems to have. It's just a beautiful thing.
You don't have that Muddy Rose record?
Not yet, but I wanted you to talk about. What's interesting is you took a lot of cross country pilgrimages, and ultimately in your younger part of your career, like you said, you had an apprentice, you had to go on the road. I was transcribing Peter Rowan last night. Vassar Clemens said, "You remember what it was like to go on the road with Bill Monroe? You'd drive all night, you'd shave with cold water, and you'd raise your hand high and smile." And what's Samson? What is his in Nashville? Where is he at right now? How is he? Have you given him any advice about how to pursue authentic music career?
Well, he's on his own path, and he's doing quite well. Actually, he turned down 8 gigs to go on his honeymoon. He's playing with. He plays with Leanne Womack, and he's playing with Brian Sutton's band. And Ricky Skaggs has hired him several times on the Grand Ole Opry and makes him play solos.
Samson is really quite already established.
Yeah, I mean, he's, did I tell you the 5 stages and the like? He's in the second stage already. The first stage is Who's Sam Grisman?
Right.
The second is Get Me Sam Grisman.
Okay.
Third is Get Me Someone That Sounds Like Sam Grisman. Fourth is Get Me Someone That Sounds Like a Young Sam Grisman. The 5th stage?
Nope.
Who's Sam Grisman? But, yeah, he's actually, quite a good little bass player, and most of his work is not from me. So
that's beautiful. It's his own.
He's like living the dream. He's he's very respectful he's very humble, actually, about his own playing, and he's buddies with all the top-notch bass players in Nashville, Dennis Crouch and Mike Bubb, and those guys, get him gigs, what they can't.
Can you equate it to, you've had, again, I brought you that Jim Post record, and it was I was so excited to play the tune, and you got a whole 20-second solo on it.
Well, I've had records that I played on, and I couldn't find me on them,
Credit.
But, I got paid, so, yeah, my session mandolin playing. They basically, whereas drummers, piano players, guitar players, bass players, they get hired for a whole album. Generally, a mandolin player, or at least I would get hired for just a couple of cuts where they wanted quote unquote color. So, it got to be kind of a formula what I would do, rhythm on the verses, tremolo on the chorus, or whatever. And so, I got used to not being featured that much, But,
would you say that Samson? Nashville is one of the more competitive. I guess it might be equivalent to the LA music scene of similar, but it's a different time now. So is he playing a lot of? When you say he's getting gigs, are they like live tour gigs or in the studio?
And
both. Really? How old is he?
He's 25.
Oh, he's and he's in the second stage.
Yeah, he's
who's David Grisman?
He's a good. He understands what to play and what to leave out, and he pays attention. He and also the kind of a lot of it is schmoozing. Once you're at a level of competency and you've got the basics and you know what to play, then a lot of it is like attitude and personality. I could name two guitar players, one that are both great guitar players, and one gets all the gigs and the other doesn't, just because personality and attitude. And when I met Hal Blaine, when I first hired Hal to play on a record, the first thing he said to me is, "Hey, I'm not on a trip about any. You tell me if you don't like something, just don't worry about it. Just tell me. I'm here to please." And he played in my band for about a year. The very first gig, it was Marin County Fair, and I got to the gig, and there's Hal Blaine sweeping the stage.
Mensch.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it, I think to be a good chief, you got to be a good Indian. And, if somebody hires you to play in their band or on their record, it's their music. And your attitude, in my opinion, should be, how can I help, rather than some kind of trip that you put on people.
I don't think... this is my third interview with the Dawg, and I don't think I really realized that you wanted to be a producer in the early 70s.
Well, I wanted to make a living.
Sure. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. But I really want to focus on this idea of the session with the Rowan brothers. You were credited as the producer under David Diadem. Diadem. Thank you. Yeah. The two drummers you hired. One guy I talked to on a weekly basis is Jim Keltner.
Oh wow,
And then the other guy was Kreutzmann. Billy Kreutzmann came in.
Well, was he on the album?
He certainly was.
He was.
But
okay.
The individual credits, it's hard to determine. I guess I have to go back and listen to it. But
I think there's another drummer on there, a guy that became their drummer.
You were trying to make a living, but the production. Yeah. Tell me about the fascination with production.
Well, I guess it was kind of the arranger. A producer can mean lots of different things. Kind of a general term that, some producers, just manage the budget. Some producers pick all the material, arrange the material, hire. I've worked for producers. Famous producers that had gold records that basically were reading the newspaper while the session was going on.
Right.
And the engineer did I became a producer in 1963 when Red Allen and Frank Wakefield were staying at my mom's house in New Jersey and playing a gig at Gertie's Folk City, which I helped them get. And Red Allen had brought a tape up that he said he sold to Mo Ash of Folkways Records. It had 10 songs on it. And I listened to the tape, and I was very familiar with Folkways Records. Folkways Records didn't have 10 songs. They had like 26 songs. And there were no mandolin instrumentals. And Frank Wakefield was revolutionizing mandolin playing and writing a lot of original tunes. And a lot of the material was, kind of country material, kind of contemporary country songs as opposed to like folk-based material. And I perceived that, this wouldn't make a great Folkways record, that it needed more material. So I told Red Allen this, and he said, well, you just call Mr. Ash and, see what happens. I called Mo Ash out of the blue. I was 18 years old. He didn't know me from Adam, or maybe he knew me through Ralph Rinsler, but he gave me a budget for 3 hours at a studio called Q Studios in New York. And
in 63.
In 1963. And I hired Bill Keith, my good friend, who had played with Red Allen before that and was playing with Bill Monroe at the time, and a good friend Fred Weiss played bass, and the session was scheduled for, I think, 7 p.m. on a Sunday night in New York City, and like 1 in the afternoon, I called Red Allen to make sure and they were watching the Redskins game.
Where were they? Were they in New York?
They were down in Hyattsville, Maryland. I said, man, you got to get up here so people, I mean, one thing is the producer gets the musicians to the studio,
Sure.
So, and, I helped them pick suggested they record some instrumentals and more traditional type tunes, and they recorded about 6 more tunes, of which I think maybe 4 went on the album, and they put out a CD, I think, of those complete sessions a couple of years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, and included several takes that were never released at the time that I didn't even hardly remember. But, I think working with musicians and arrangements and all of that appealed to me. I guess, I liked arranging music. I liked, let's get that bass player. Let's get this banjo player, or, I did a good friend of mine, Peter Siegel, who taught me how to edit tape. We were students at NYU together, and he became a record producer for Elektra, and we both were interested in recording this. People like Ralph Rinsler and Mike Seeger and John Cohn were out in the field recording traditional,
Sure.
Mike rediscovered Doc Boggs, and Ralph rediscovered Clarence Ashley and discovered Doc Watson and recorded them in their natural environment. John Cohn discovered Roscoe Holcomb, and this was all a very inspirational thing. These guys were coming back they brought their tape recorder down and recorded these guys, and it was amazing music, and you didn't really, and that interested me. So I started making little trips with my tape recorder. And if you're familiar with the kitchen tapes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I made that tape, and started recording live.
Can you tell the audience who was part of
that?
That
was Red Allen and Frank Wakefield.
Yeah.
I got the first. Ralph Rinsler called me up in August of 1961, one Sunday morning, and I guess I was 16 years old, and he said, "Hey, I'm driving down to Rising Sun, Maryland today to hear Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Want to come?" So naturally, I went and heard Bill Monroe for the first time. And the opening, they had usually 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 other acts to the main act opening. And they had a band there called Marvin Howell, Frankie Short, and the Franklin County Boys. And their mandolin player was a young guy named Frank Wakefield. and who in 1961 was about as close to sounding like Bill Monroe as you could get. And I got the mistaken impression that all these guys sounded like that,
Right.
and which was a great thing for me to think.
They burn.
And I became interested in Frank Wakefield's music, and then a couple of years later I heard that he had joined forces with Red Allen and was playing in a certain bar in Washington, D.C., and on my spring break from NYU, I went down there with my Wallensack tape machine and my mandolin and walked into this little dive. And Frank Wakefield took me home with him that night. And next day, I said, hey, I don't know how it came about. I said, Red Allen came over his house, and I said, you mind if I record you guys? And they just played for 2 hours with Frank's baby screaming in the background. And I probably transcribed every lick off that tape. It was just for my own enjoyment,
you know, right.
or and then several months after that, we ended up making that Folkways album.
Actually, I picked that album up. I found that a few years ago, produced by David Grisman. The Rowan Brothers, what was tempting about producing that? That is a mercurial album, to say the least. It's interesting because you. Yeah. So can you talk about?
Well, let's see. That would have been around 1971, 72.
Yep.
And bluegrass music, it just hadn't. I wasn't burned out on it, but I mean it wasn't offering me any opportunities to make a living. And by that time, I had 2 kids, and I was the popular music of the late '60s. I mean, the the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It was kind of a fertile time for a lot of experimentation with
Hendrix,
that. Yeah, Jimi Hendrix and just a lot of the fusion music. There was a lot going on.
Sure.
And some really good musicians. And a friend of mine named Richard Loren, who just wrote a book.
I want to talk to Richard.
Yeah.
The former.
I'm sure he'll talk to you.
Yeah, right.
He was my agent in Earth Opera in 67, 68, and became friends. And we talked about. I had made some recordings in a studio in Boston just for the heck of it, putting different groups of musicians together. And Chris Rowan, I'd met both of Peter Rowan's younger brothers, and they both were writing really good songs. Mm-hmm. And I did recorded Chris Rowan doing one of his songs, and I decided, and they were all on their, Lauren Rowan had his little group. He had a really talented piano player, Bill
Stevenson?
No, Bill Stevenson was in the Earth Opera. This was another guy, Bill Elliott, I think.
Bill Elliott, interesting.
I think that was his name.
Interesting.
And they had a duo, and Chris Rowan had a little group, and I got the idea of putting them together, kind of like Everly Brothers of the of the 1970s or something.
Right.
And there was another artist named Jack Bonus who had played with Earth Opera. He was a really good saxophone player, but he was a great singer, and he had some good. He was writing really good songs, and we decided to form this production company and try to produce. It was obviously pop music of a certain kind, but it was music.
It's still, for me, that album, it's an acquired taste. It's a very interesting album. And I haven't
heard it in years.
And most people talk about it as a complete...
It was a big failure. I mean, a commercial failure.
Right, and those things often they come around in history and resonate.
And that was the end of my career in producing pop records. But hey, I did get Jim Keltner, and I thought it was a good album, I thought.
You know,
at the
Keltner
time.
was a jazz snob.
Wow.
I mean, this guy would sit in the front row of the Dragonwick Club in Los Angeles and watch Charles Lloyd and Bobby Hutcherson play.
Wow.
Lloyd dubbed them the modern jazz proteges.
Wow.
But then Keltner, like you, young family, had to support the family.
Yeah.
Hal Blaine gave him his
He's
first.
one of the few musicians who had a really amazing sense of time.
Well, I mean, but nobody knows this, but you go to Gobbler Zabo albums, who's drumming on them? Keltner. Claire Fisher albums on contemporary, it's Keltner. So his background was in jazz, which is just great. I just love the fact that, regardless of the Rowan Brothers album, to bring in cats like Keltner who were jazz lovers, and they could swing and they could feel.
Yeah.
That you put that into any other.
But he was really, I mean, at that time, he was playing on John Lennon's record. He had that like Ringo Starr thing, but he kind of had. And, another band that I really dug at that time was the Mad Dogs and Englishmen, who I went to see several times.
Really?
And they had two drummers, Jim Gordon and Jim Keltner.
And
Leon Russell.
They had double drums at that time?
Yeah. That was an amazing band.
Well,
With
I mean,
Joe
we're learning.
Cocker,
we're learning.
Leon Russell.
I wanted to ask you if you could talk to the audience, maybe even demonstrate on the mandolin. Part of what in my intro, you came up with this song called "Limestones."
Oh,
which is
actually we open the show with that now.
Good. It's Limehouse Blues.
Yeah.
A fusion of that and Milestones.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to take us through how you came up with the two concepts to fuse it to the song and maybe show.
I don't know how I did that, but just change the string. So, Limehouse Blues kind of goes like. Etc. And Milestones kind of goes. So I kind of combined elements from both of them and got. It's also the harmonic, the chords, a C seventh and an A seventh, but and just having we started with that kind of like sing, sing, sing kind of tom, Gene Krupa.
War cry kind of thing. Yeah, right.
And then we go into a kind of hard swing bop groove. Mm-hmm. It's just combining elements.
I mean, like, it just was. I love the idea that you were just thinking. I mean, that you took those two things and fused them together. I mean, I guess.
And some people never got that, actually, even with who was it? It was a friend of mine, a musician, never.
And then the Hot Swing Club of
or even earlier than that, Limestones was
Limehouse.
I mean, Limehouse Blues was kind of a pop tune from the 20s.
Did you these just wonderful books? The book of Dawg,
Dawg
Jazz.
Man.
I mean, these are for musicians like my engineer Jackson who love to read music and play music, or just for myself to get background. It's phenomenal stuff, but please tell me, 1973, this is now, we're past the Rowan Brothers. You've already been doing a lot of recordings, but you talk briefly about a mandolin changing experience with Jethro Burns. It was a life-changing experience. Taking a cross-country trip.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was that? Can take us through that and why it blew your mind.
Well, Jethro's playing blew my mind when I first heard it on record, which around 63, I believe, or 62, Homer Jethro released a record called Playing It Straight. And good friend of mine, banjo player named Steve Arkin, who you may have or may not have heard of. He was Alan Arkin's cousin, among other things, but he played with Bill Monroe briefly in 1964, I think. He was kind of a musical disciple of Bill Keith and a very funny guy. We were hanging around, I think we went to Sam Goody's record store in Manhattan and found this record, Homer Jethro playing it straight. They were playing jazz standards.
Unbelievable.
And
what label was it on?
It was on RCA. It was produced by Chet Atkins.
RCA, of course.
Who was Jethro's brother-in-law.
Unbelievable.
So, and they did a follow-up album a couple of years later called "It Ain't Necessarily Square." But so we brought this home to Steve's house in Brooklyn and put it on the turntable. And we didn't realize that the turntable was set for 45 RPM. A little faster, And the first song on that record, I think, is called "If Dreams Come True," and it starts slow. And so it wasn't readily apparent to us that this was running fast, this record, until he starts taking off, And then we, oh, my God, And then we realized it was running fast. But even so, it was incredible playing, and it kind of blew my mind to hear jazz on the mandolin. I'm just starting to listen to jazz, but never, I'm a slow learner.
Well, you just didn't see it incorporating it into
I mean, I love jazz, but I couldn't. In fact, I actually went out and got, a few years after this, bought an alto sax.
Right.
Because I figured you had to play a jazz instrument to play jazz. But anyhow, let's see, the Jethro.
So it says you were taking a road trip and you run into
that
Jethro
was
Burns
in '73. So I had been familiar with Jethro through these recordings.
Yes.
And I heard somewhere that he was teaching mandolin at, I think, a store called Maine Music in Evanston, Illinois, every Tuesday afternoon. So I was planning this cross-country trip, and about a month before that, or several weeks, on a Tuesday afternoon, I called up and asked if he was there. He was, and I booked a lesson with him for this particular, where I would time my trip to end up there on a Tuesday afternoon, which I did, and went in and followed some 14-year-old girl and after her lesson, and we hit it off pretty good, and the hour was up, and there was another student waiting there. It was a teenage boy, and Jethro asked him if he could wait a little bit. This guy came from California, and he's a good mandolin player, and so he spent a little more time with me. And years later, I found out that guy was Don Sternberg, waiting in the wings there, and
wow, for
his lesson. And I was so impressed with Jethro. I mean, he just opened me up to all this stuff that I had.
I mean, is it simple enough to say that well, you were listening to the records, but that day in particular, was there any kind of...
Well, just meeting a guy like that.
Mm-hmm.
He's such an incredible person and player, and he was using black diamond strings on his mandolin. And I was so smitten with Jethro that I bought a set of black diamond mandolin strings and immediately put them on my mandolin. And by the end of the trip, I'd taken them off, but...
Was Spud Boy in? Did you tell Spud Boy about that?
That was 73. So yeah,
it was in the midst of. I mean, so you incorporated that whatever.
Well, by then I was kind of on my own path, and I didn't start transcribing Jethro solos. I mean, they were very different. He was such a different player than what I was becoming anyway. But I just it just influenced me in other ways.
Your psyche. Can you talk about? I love that term. The musical psyche? What can you break that down? Because I've never heard anybody put it like that. Not necessarily physical playing. It's the emotional. It's the nervous system.
Well, yeah, it's just if you go to Hawaii and go out into the jungle in Hawaii, it's tropical. It's a vibe, a certain vibe. You get, whether you like it or not, you're there,
yeah, right.
and this is it.
Yeah,
and it's got its own humidity, its feel to it, its atmosphere, and I think every musician has got their own kind of musical destiny. They have their own musical personality that, and sometimes it doesn't come out for years, or sometimes or a lot of musicians kind of dedicate themselves to playing like, Earl Scruggs or,
They sound like somebody.
Yeah, and they're on that path. But, a lot other musicians, have their own kind of unique thing, and that's what they end up doing. But I think we all start learning from somewhere. And I'm a strong believer in, imitation, or learning exactly how Bill Monroe played something, or Earl Scruggs, or Benny Goodman, or Ben Webster, or Jethro, and you have to, like there's a museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, that's completely devoted to the artwork of Salvador Dali.
Right.
And you go in there, it's sort of like one huge room, and you walk around the periphery, and it's all like in chronological order. And you can see the first 10 years, he's copying Matisse, he's copying Picasso, he's copying.
Right.
And all of a sudden, Dali starts emerging. And it wasn't right away. He was learning from people that inspired him.
Samson kind of was Samson in that realm too, where you were like, he's copying this person. Now he's Samson himself.
Well, he's definitely been influenced by. He's got his. He's been more influenced by like his favorite musician in the world is Stuart Duncan, the fiddle player, and before that it was Jerry Douglas. I mean, he's very passionate about music and has gotten into.
And he loves his dad too. He loves his father.
Yeah, he grew up with that.
You can see in his. I mean, there's pictures. I've never met him, but the trio that you guys have.
Oh, did you hear that record?
He is on his own path, but he has a deep respect for the fact that you went on your own path, and that has given. I think it's invigorating for younger.
Yeah.
I think in this day and age, when there's so much out there, and it's so easy to comp other people, that to go and find your own individual path, you do have to start, emulating people, but then slowly it forms into this beautiful thing. I mean, I don't know. It's
he's always very he was always very critical musically. We'd be listening to. I drive him this, middle school, and we'd be listening to bluegrass records, and he'd go, clam, clam, clam. He'd be noticing bass mistakes.
Clam.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Or sometimes if we were listening to Django and Stefan, he would pick up on a little lick that either one of them would play. Everyone, and there it is again. There it is again. And he'd pick up on things, kind of things that I wouldn't even pick up on.
Right. I want to talk to you about goulash and borscht.
Okay.
Again, this is a revelation.
What about shav? You know what that is?
No, what is it?
That's kind of like green borscht.
Now, so the thing I was not aware of, again, mind blowing.
Yeah.
We're going to have to do about 9 hours of interviews, but you were doing film scores. You brought up The King of Gypsies before. That was off a book score. Peter Maas book.
Yeah.
But I want to talk to you. I mean, you've done several, Eat My Dust, a few other ones as well. But with The King of Gypsies, for instance, do you put yourself inside? I mean, you talked about living in these restaurants and eating all this borscht. And
Well, that was the way I was putting it. I was looking for a fiddle player. I started going to Russian restaurants, and because occasionally they'd have gypsy, quote unquote.
Well, that's what I'm talking.
Yeah.
So you were going there because they would have authentic music there.
Yeah.
And what did
I did my research. You know, there used to be a little record store in San Francisco, somewhere. It was near Wally Hyder's studio.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's kind of the Tenderloin district, somewhat. And they had a lot of obscure foreign records, and I got some records of authentic gypsy music there because I got this assignment. I was on my first tour in Europe with Bill Keith, actually, in 1977. Mm-hmm. I got this message from Craig.
Mr. Miller.
They want to hire me to write this music for King of the Gypsies. And I got real excited because I thought it was going to be like The Godfather. It was this real rich cultural thing.
Right.
And then they brought me. I was hired by Federico De Laurentiis, who was very young. He was like 22 years old.
Any relation to Dino?
He was his son.
Thank you. Okay.
And he was producing his first film. And he heard my first quintet album in Tower Records in Hollywood and said, that's what I want for this score, for this. That's how I got the gig. But I had done 3 other film scores for Roger Corman, Eat My Dust, Capone, and
Big Fat Mama?
Yeah, Big Bad Mama.
Big Bad
that was
Mama?
the first one.
Yeah.
And they always brought you in. The music gets added after the film is made. So they would always bring me in and introduce me to the director. Mm-hmm. And they'd always say, and they'd give you the screenplay. And they'd say, so what do you think of the screenplay? I always said, oh, it's great, Well, they gave me this screenplay. And I had read the Peter Maas book. And I read the screenplay, and I thought it was really bad. And they brought me in. The director was there. It's an Academy Award-winning director, Frank Pearson, unbeknownst to me, they asked me what I thought of the screenplay, and I said, well,
You didn't know it was...
Yawn. I was hoping for something with a little more, cultural depth, stuff like that. And this guy wrote the screenplay. So we got off to a very bad start, and which never really improved. But
I can't see how it would.
He put a lot of pressure on me. He kept rejecting stuff. And I was given Real Gypsies, the music, goosebumps. But he was having an affair with the choreographer, and he hated everything I wrote.
It didn't matter. Yeah, okay.
Or at least kept it. It ultimately worked out. Actually, he finally, after it was all over, wrote me a letter of apology. But
did he really?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so you were in,
which I don't have, but maybe I'll find it somewhere.
You were able to get Grappelli on the session?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I had I was going to these Hungarian restaurants and trying to find because this, unlike the other movies, they wanted, or Federico, this young, really talented guy, wanted the music involved all through making the movie. Mm-hmm. They wanted live music. And so not only did they need, the right musicians, they had to look like gypsies or to him or the director, So after looking around for a gypsy violinist, one day I just had this idea. Stefan Grappelli, who I had just met as a fan, like a year before he came to San Francisco I think in '76, for the first time. Played the Great American Music Hall, and I just went backstage as a fan and gave him a copy of my first quintet record. But so I got this idea, well, this is Dino De Laurentiis. Maybe he can get Stefan Grappelli. So, well, they never heard of Stefan Grappelli, but I guess he was playing in New York. He was coming to New York. They went down and saw him, and they hired him. And I'll never forget the first day I got together with Stefan to show him this music was on my birthday in 1978. And I always said that I was destined to be in the record business because I was born in 45 and I was 33 in 78.
There you go. I was born in 78.
Really?
No,
You were born?
I was born in March 78.
March what?
14th.
Oh,
But yeah, 33 to that
works out.
I dig. Stefan, can you talk about is there any noticeable difference? Obviously, the screenplay, put that aside, but when you're putting together music for a soundtrack, how is it different than doing a regular album?
Well,
with Stefan, for instance, especially because these people were like more into the superficial part. They wanted them to look like gypsies.
They also wanted real gypsy. They wanted good music. I mean,
sure, hopefully.
Well, that whole experience was kind of twofold. There was being in the movie and recording, playing music in the movie, and then there was recording after the movie was made, the background music and that kind of, And actually, we were at the Playboy Club in Boonton, New Jersey, where I had gone to Camp Ahika Boy Scout camp, and it was like 1 a.m. They'd been filming these dancers, who the director was having an affair with the choreographer. Her claim to fame was she choreographed hair. And they did all this dancing. They're filming these dancers for hours. And finally, okay, we're ready for the music. And I had hired my own engineer, Bill Wolf, who recorded my first few albums. He was a brilliant engineer. But he wasn't in the right union, and they made a big the engineers there wouldn't let him touch anything, So he ended up playing in the band, but
the engineer did.
The guy I hired,
sure.
And so the engineer who recorded, okay, now it's time to record this live music. One take. Okay, that's great. Couldn't have gotten it recorded right. They didn't even do a rundown. I mean, so sure enough, every day they would had the whole cast camping out in this Playboy Club near where they were filming the exteriors somewhere on the grounds there. And every day they'd have what they call rushes. They show you what they filmed the day before. So next day I went in and saw this music scene. All the sound was distorted. So my friend John Carlini, who helped me with those books and was in my band later, he was working on the film with me as an arranger, and we were having some drinks in the bar at night, and we went up to go to bed, and I realized I had a camera. I left my camera at the bar, so I went back down, and I left it on the floor. Somebody else is sitting there. It's the engineer who recorded this, screwed up this recording. So he looks at me and said, "What'd you think of the recording?" I said, "Well, I'm going to have to replace it all. It's all distorted. What's there to think? You didn't get it right, pal." So after the movie was all edited and everything, we had this scene, and I couldn't use the live music. So I said to Stefan, "Can you replace your solo?"
Oh, man.
He said, "No, impossible. I always play different, I had Daryl Anger transcribe his solo. and I had this relationship with Stefan where he generally tell everybody no, including me, but I always was able to get him to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And I had Daryl transcribe his solo that he was playing in this film, and we actually got him to replace it, and we replaced the whole band, and I mean, it sounded great, and you couldn't tell because so often in movies, especially older movies, you see people playing in the film and their hands aren't doing
this is so
what
fascinating.
the music
Yeah,
is,
I mean the up and down is,
But it's a bit, it's a big political scene, especially
huge.
Especially coming in the making of the movie. The composer is usually after the fact, so he doesn't have to deal with all that politics. But this Federico, he wanted it live in the film, so I got involved. John Carlini was there before me, and when I arrived in New York, I was just happy-go-lucky. I had all these gypsy tunes. I didn't really care about how big my name would be or all these other issues that actors and people in the film were all real. That's all they cared about, really. I mean, and there were a lot of heavyweight actors. Sterling Hayden was in that movie, and Shelley Winters. And Shelley Winters was the last scene was filmed in a cemetery. And they were burying, I guess, what was that guy? What was his name? He was in a TV series. Anyhow, he was Shelley Winters' son. They were burying him in this scene. And she was sitting there trying to work up to make herself cry. And she had headphones on. She was listening to... what's that? Barbara Streisand's recording of what's that? Her Big People or something. One of those soupy Barbara Streisand songs to make her cry. I thought that was funny.
Can you talk to the audience about? I read somewhere about you were feverishly working on something, and you developed a lot of tendinitis.
Yeah.
Can you talk about? A performance live where you played the most excruciating pain that you played through. Part of my show is overcoming adversity, so I just because there are cats that huge admirers of you that say, my family was in tons of we my grandparents, we had all these mandolins. And I tried to play him, and I said, "Forget this. The frets it's too small. I'm going to just use the." And so I wanted you to talk about playing through pain, or what was the anguish. And
I've had that. I'm sure a lot of musicians and for sure athletes. If you overwork any kind of muscle, and that's what gave me the first recognizable bout of tendinitis. I was working on. It was in 1978. I had this movie score. And I also just got signed to A&M Records. We saw an interview with Herb Alpert last night.
I just interviewed Herb.
No kidding.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah. You were signed to A&M? Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
It was Tommy LaPuma.
I interviewed Tommy, too. Great cat.
Was forming a little sub-label called Horizon, A&M Horizon.
Sure.
And he signed me to that. And So I just signed this contract record that would be Hot Dog. And unlike the first quintet record, I decided I would play both mandolin parts,
right,
rhythm and the lead. Because, Stefan told me that Django, the reason they had the three guitar players in the quintet of the Hot Club of France was because Django told him, when you play a solo, you have me behind you. when I want two guitar players.
Right.
See, he looked at it quantitatively. So, when I got the idea to have two mandolins in the quintet, the idea was to have a rhythm player behind me because holding in the way, I would notice when I play a solo, kind of the rhythm would sag, which had nothing to do with the instruments. But I thought if I had me, which I equated to a mandolin player. And Todd did a great job, but he was really a bass player, and I met him. He was taking mandolin lessons. And Mike Marshall, too, I would just give him I wanted to hear me behind me. So I decided on this second recording that I would do that, and I spent 4 days just playing rhythm. And by then I was playing a lot of, kind of physically exerting chords, double bar chords. And some of these tunes, they were like extended solos. So how long do you play for? You play a long time, multiple takes.
Right.
After 3 or 4 days, I noticed my arm is on fire, my left forearm. I just kind of blotted it out for a few days, and then I realized, I'm really in pain here. What's going on? And then I started going to see. I went to a guy that works on the New York Giants, and I started going to all kinds of specialists. I determined I had tendonitis, and the verdict was stop playing. Well, I had 2 contracts, a movie score and a record. And how do you do that? If you read the fine print, there's somewhere in there it says if you can't physically perform your job, goodbye.
Right.
So
it's a conundrum.
And Richard Green, he thought it was all psychological, but it was physical, and I worked through it.
Scotty Stoneman would have said it was psychological too. The burn. That guy was. But ultimately, what came? How did you just take a couple weeks off, or did you just play through it?
Well, I basically, when I took time off, I actually wrote a solo on the piano that I overdubbed on Hot Dog, a tune called Dawg Ola.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting about that. I have a friend named Bernard Glanspeak who was living in Alaska, and he had 2 twin sons who were talented musically, and one was learning the vibes, and he learned that solo. And I thought
that is tripped out.
And I thought, wow, because that's that solo I actually composed, so I wouldn't have, because at the time, and I've told this in that book, I'm not sure. I wasn't that familiar. I write tunes, but I'm not the world's greatest improviser, or at least at that time. And a C minor was not that familiar to me, so I figured, well, I'll write a solo on the piano and then record it. It'll save me time and pain in the studio.
And then that dude
and I would take a couple of Percodan and do a session.
Sure.
One final question for you, Dawg. I know you got to get to rehearsal. It came to me last night, totally on a whim, but how did you and Jerry reconnect after 16 years? Did it have anything to do with the fact that you both had babies, young kids at the time? I just go ahead.
Yeah. It really had to do with the Grateful Dead has this foundation called the Rex Foundation.
Sure.
Their charitable
still happening
arm, yeah. And one day I went to the mailbox, and they had this Ralph Award, who
big fan.
I lived next.
I know
next
you did.
door to
I
Ralph.
know.
But
and you also live next to Jazzbo.
Well, not next to him, but
neighbors.
Yeah. Anyhow, one day I go to the mailbox, and there's a check for $10,000 from the Rex Foundation. Every year they give this award, and it's a real award, not like a piece of paper. It's like money here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, wow, I called him up to thank him and found out Jerry was behind it. And Jerry and I hadn't really...
Was it a reimbursement from the money they used for the Grateful Dead movie because they took all that Old and in the Way money?
Well, I don't know.
Anyway, it was a gift. It was a gift from Jerry.
Yeah, it was every year they gave an award to some musician that they thought deserved that. So I found out Jerry had recommended it was me, and I called him up to thank him, and we decided to get together. We had run into each other, I think, a year or two before that, or somewhere on a Pete Sears session.
Sure. Right.
And we hadn't talked in a long time. He just went, and oddly enough, the last time we played together, I was just rehearsing my quintet, and Tony Rice was coming out to spend a few days with us in 1975, in the fall of 1975. And I went downtown Mill Valley to get some ice cream and ran into Jerry at what's that ice cream? There's one in Petaluma. It's Baskin Robbins.
Baskin Robbins, yes, sure.
Yeah. And there was Jerry getting some ice cream, and I invited him up to the house to jam, and he came up, and Daryl and Todd and maybe Joe Carroll were there, and he came up and we jammed for an hour or two, and then I had to go to the airport to pick up Tony Rice.
Unbelievable.
And,
that was the last time you jammed.
And
you didn't see him after that for a while.
And I didn't see him, for about 12 or 13 years.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then things really took.
Then I ran into him at this session. We had a long talk, and then I got this award, and I called him up to thank him, and he said, "Hey, we should get together." And I invited him over, and I was just building my studio in the basement of my house, and he came in, and the first thing he said is, we should make a record together because that'll give us an excuse to get together and play. And I said, wow, I just built the studio down here, and I started my own record company. He said, great, we'll do it for you. And we just went down, and I hooked up microphones, and the first thing we recorded was, I'm setting the dials, and then I go out and we played some, and I called this young guy, Dave Dennison, who had kind of applied for the job as my engineer, and I told him, I've got a guitar player over here, and we want to make a tape. I didn't tell him who it was, and he came in and about fainted because he had moved to California because Jerry and I were his favorite musicians, so he...
Handsome Cabin Boy, when did you figure out that you both loved that song? Did you just pick it up?
Well, we just would try to think of songs.
It's classic.
That was on that A.L. Lloyd Blow Boys Blow record, and Ralph Rinsler played mandolin on that. Have you heard that original of that?
No, I had no idea.
Man.
But so much more to get to with David Grisman, but our time has come to an end. He's got to get rehearsed this sextet.
I got to start cracking the whip.
And we look forward to seeing the performance tonight at the Mesa Performing Arts Center. I believe tickets are still available. 7 p.m. kickoff. David Grisman, it's always an honor. It's great to meet you in person.
Hey, great to meet you.
All right, brother?
Yeah.
We'll take it back to the studio. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. Take it easy.